What I wanted to start the conversation with is looking at sort of some of your big picture thoughts. And so what we'd like to do if Steve would run the video one, and it's an excerpt, about a 4-minute excerpt or animation
Yep.
of your dealing with the changing world order.
Yeah, if I may, just
yes,
introduce a bit. It's always been important for me, especially now, to try to communicate clearly. And I found animation to be very effective as well as the books. And there is a big cycle we're going to talk about that only if you study it over hundreds of years can you actually see the nature of this cycle. And we're in a big cycle. And so I did this 40-minute video. It's called The Changing World Order, and it corresponds with the book I wrote called The Changing World Order. But this is a 4-minute clip that tries to get it down to 4 minutes what that big cycle looks like.
Yeah. It's very exciting. I mean, I think that's one of the most compelling things I find about your investment style is that having lived through, we were just talking about this before in 2006, and people are just totally oblivious of what's going on around them. And what I think is so impressive about you is how you study the big picture, the cycles, and you can sort of see some of those turning points. But anyway, if Steve, if you could run the video one, please.
I studied the 10 most powerful empires over the last 500 years and the last 3 reserve currencies. It took me through the rise and decline of the Dutch Empire and the guilder, the British Empire and the pound, the rise and early decline in the United States Empire and the dollar, and the decline and rise of the Chinese Empire and its currencies, as well as the rise and decline of the Spanish, German, French, Indian, Japanese, Russian, and Ottoman empires, along with their significant conflicts, as measured in this chart. To understand China's patterns better, I also studied the rise and fall of Chinese dynasties and their monies back to the year 600. Because looking at all these measures at once can be confusing, I'll focus on the 4 most important ones: the Dutch, British, US, and Chinese. You'll quickly notice the pattern. Now let's simplify the form a bit. As you can see, they transpired in overlapping cycles that lasted about 250 years, with 10 to 20-year transition periods between them. Typically, these transitions have been periods of great conflict because leading powers don't decline without a fight. So how am I measuring an empire's power? In this study, I used 8 metrics. Each country's measure of total power is derived by averaging them together. They are education, inventiveness and technology development, competitiveness in global markets, economic output, share of world trade, military strength, the power of their financial center for capital markets, and the strength of their currency as a reserve currency. Because these powers are measurable, we can see how strong each country is now, was in the past, and whether they're rising or declining. By examining the sequences from many countries, we can see how a typical cycle transpires. And because the wiggles can be confusing, we can simplify it a bit to focus on the pattern of cause-effect relationships that drive the rise and decline of a typical empire. As you can see, better education typically leads to increased innovation and technology development, and with a lag, the establishment of the currency as a reserve currency. You can also see that these forces then declined in a similar order, reinforcing each other's decline. Let's now look at the typical sequence of events going on inside a country that produces these rises and declines. In a nutshell, the big cycle typically begins after a major conflict, often a war, establishes the new leading power and the new world order. Because no one wants to challenge this power, a period of peace and prosperity typically follows. As people get used to this peace and prosperity, they increasingly bet on it continuing. They borrow money to do that, which eventually leads to a financial bubble. The empire's share of trade grows, and when most transactions are conducted in its currency, it becomes a reserve currency, which leads to even more borrowing. At the same time, this increased prosperity distributes wealth unevenly, so the wealth gap typically grows between the rich haves and the poor have-nots. Eventually, the financial bubble bursts, which leads to the printing of money and increased internal conflict between the rich and the poor, which leads to some form of revolution to redistribute wealth. This can happen peacefully or as a civil war. While the empire struggles with this internal conflict, its power diminishes relative to external rival powers on the rise. When a new rising power gets strong enough to compete with the dominant power that is having domestic breakdowns, external conflicts, most typically wars, take place. Out of these internal and external wars come new winners and losers. Then the winners get together to create the new world order, and the cycle begins again.
Great,
That's
thank
the
you.
best I could do in 4 minutes, but it's a lot more complicated than that.
Yeah, so given that, I just wanted, I thought that was a great way to try to get everyone up to speed on the book if they haven't read it yet. So where would you say, given your sense of cycles, where are we in the US today? Do you see it in that process?
I'd like to describe that there are 5 main forces that we see repeat over those times, those were indicators of power, but the 5 main forces are, there's the debt, money, economy force. How much can you increase debt? How does the mechanics of that work? I'm a financial guy, and we're here as we live in that world, so we can talk about the mechanics of that.
Yes.
The second is the internal political force, which there's a cycle of cooperation and confrontation. When there's large wealth and values gaps, we see much greater populism and extremism, and which each side says, fight for me, and the idea of compromising doesn't, and working well together becomes a problem politically, and we see that becomes worse and worse. So that force, with the debt force, is happening. We can see the political nature, that populism of the extreme and how it's working is very much with us. And the last time that happened, you'd have to go back to the 1930 to 45 period. Number 3 is the geopolitical conflict, the great powers conflict. Graham Allison described the Thucydides trap. In other words, there's an order that described here. When you have a winner of a war, they set the rules. So in 1945, the United States won the war, was the dominant power. That's why the United Nations is in New York, and the World Bank and the IMF are in Washington, D.C. The dollar is the world's reserve currency, and we got a monopoly on military power. And then there's a cycle where there's others rising, described there. So the third is that great power conflict. Have I lost my mind?
Yeah.
I have. Okay. Can somebody help me with that? Sorry. I could just talk this way. I'll hold it.
That's easier until we
Does that
get
work?
somebody.
Does that work? Can you
Yeah.
hear me?
I think,
Okay.
you can hear in the back okay? I think they're good.
So the debt money one, the internal conflict one, particularly over wealth and values politically. Number 3 is the external, who is in control? What are the rules of the game? Number 4, throughout history, even more important than the first 3, is acts of nature, drought, floods, and pandemics, have killed more people than wars, have toppled more orders than these other items. And certainly today, climate is a big, big one. So we should talk about the debt one. We have the internal political one. Number 3, we have the geopolitical one. Number 4, we certainly have the acts of nature one. And number 5 is throughout history, man's inventiveness, particularly of new technologies, has had revolutionary effects. And certainly that is a factor today in an almost unparalleled way. And then when you see the story repeat over and over, what you see is that how they interact. When you line them up and how they interact, they create the great cycle. So for example, when you have a lot of, let's say, debt and vulnerabilities, and you have a political conflict and an external conflict, and the same time as you have climate disruptions or costs, we have big costs. It's estimated that the climate issue is going to cost us $8 trillion a year, which is 8% of world GDP. And then we deal with the technology. We're in that kind of transition. So when we talk, I think when we talk about anything, it falls into any one of those categories. Everything important falls into one of those categories, and they relate to each other.
Yeah.